Hey there, thank you for tuning into the e-learning champion pod. I'm your host Alekha. Welcome to our podcast on training a hybrid workforce actionable insights, presented by Comlab India. Our speaker is Shalini Mergu, Director for Learning Solutions at Comlab. She has over 18 years of experience in customer consulting, instructional design, including ILT, VILT, and e-learning. A hearty welcome, Shalini.
Thanks, Sarika. And I'd like to just very quickly touch upon what I intend covering today. We'll start by examining what exactly constitutes a hybrid workplace and who these remote employees are that we need to be mindful of. Following that, we'll discuss a couple of challenges in training a hybrid workforce because managing a hybrid workforce is itself challenging, and training them presents an even higher degree of challenge. And finally, we'll explore some effective training strategies and best practices. To kick off this session, I'd like to ask a quick question. What is the biggest challenge as an L&D professional in training a hybrid workforce? So do pause for a second to think about what do you think is the biggest challenge? Of course, there are multiple challenges, and each one of us has our own top ones. So, is it balancing in person and remote communication? Or is it ensuring engagements are tailored to the virtual medium? And what about reducing learner isolation? And then there are technical difficulties, sometimes, involved in remote access. Not to forget fostering collaboration across environments. So, we'll delve into each of these challenges today and explore how we can make our hybrid training come alive.
Wow, great. Looking forward to this podcast. So, starting with our first question today, can you first define what we mean by hybrid work? And sometimes there are varying interpretations of this phrase. So, would like to
Sure,
hear thoughts on that.
sure. Well, generally speaking, a hybrid workforce consists of employees who work remotely and those who work in an office or a central location. Now, employees can decide where they are most productive or choose a combination of both based on their preferences, which means that some employees will only work remotely from home, while other employees will work only in the office. Finally, some employees will work at home for a couple of days a week, and a couple of days they are in office for the remaining rest of the week. Now, this flexibility can actually work either to our advantage or disadvantage, depending on how intentional we are about leveraging this model. And of course, there is a heavy reliance on technology and digital tools in the hybrid model. So that also puts on us the onus to ensure that we provide equal opportunity when it comes to learning experiences for both sets of learners, the in person and the remote. And of course, the constantly changing work environment also requires constant adaptation from us as an organization, particularly in this post pandemic era where remote work options have become more prevalent. And with that, of course, comes the challenge of training a hybrid workforce. Now, various industries have specific hybrid workforce models which have been tailored to their needs. And this is not something new. For instance, in healthcare, research is often conducted remotely, while face to face interactions with patients may still be necessary. Similarly, in manufacturing, supply chain management often occurs remotely, while actual production obviously requires an on site presence. So, these industry specific models highlight the diverse nature of hybrid work and the requirement for tailored training approaches. So far we were looking at it from the viewpoint of the L&D professional who is tasked to train the hybrid workforce. But just for a minute, I'd like to encourage you to step into the shoes of a remote learner. I'm not sure how many of us here have that experience as remote learners or remote employees, but what do you think is the biggest challenge for a remote learner? So do keep this at the back of your mind as we proceed to look at what are some of the challenges. Now, some possible ones are, engaging with the content. As a remote learner, I find it difficult to stay engaged without being distracted. Probably my motivation levels will be not as high as it would be for the in person learners. And As a remote learner, accessing up to date learnings and engaging with my colleagues, not just during the session, but before and after, can be a big challenge. So sometimes it really does appear like the in person learners do have an unfair advantage. So, how do we as L&D professionals level this playing field, level the learning field, so to speak? I'd like to begin with addressing learner isolation. I think that's one thing that we all experienced, especially during the pandemic. It's something where a lot of us, I think employee isolation is something we experienced during the pandemic when a lot of us were working purely remotely. And it really felt like we were out of touch with our company's culture. And, you know, we found ways to minimize this isolation as an organization, as managers, and as individuals. There's an interesting statistic here that I'd like to share. It's according to a Forbes report. 53% of remote workers say it's harder to feel connected to their coworkers. Now, given that this is the backdrop, you can imagine how much more they may tend to feel isolated during hybrid training when clearly, the in-person group seems to have more opportunities for engagement, more opportunities to feel connected. So, learner isolation is one of the biggest challenges, and that's something we need to be very, very mindful of.
Okay, what about cultural and geographical barriers?
Yeah, Lika, that's also a good point because that can be a huge challenge with dispersed teams.
Yeah.
And as facilitators and L&D professionals setting up the learning experiences, uh, we need to really ensure that we connect to the remote learners and connect to those across different geographies, different cultural backgrounds, because otherwise we'll end up losing the entire impact of the training, and then outcomes will be very skewed in favor of only the in-person learners. So that is something that there are bound to be cultural and linguistic barriers. Maybe not so much the linguistic barriers because, there is a common official language in most organizations that we tend to use. Uh, Maybe, the cultural barriers could come into play, which could really affect the quality of our training. If we, as facilitators and designers of those learning experiences, are not intentional about being very inclusive, and again, you have, time zone differences kick in when there are geographically dispersed teams. And that's another thing we need to factor for when we provide an equitable, fair level learning field. And of course, the communication collaboration hurdles continue to be one of the biggest challenges because it's so much easier to just talk to a person who's sitting across you. So, with hybrid training, the engagement has to be more meticulously planned. And again, there is this added aspect of, uh, a burnout from digital communication tools. The in-person learners are probably not going to experience it much, even though they may be sitting at their laptops all day. But for the remote learner, it is an added factor that really causes fatigue. I think communication fatigue, especially digital communication fatigue, is a real thing, and we need to address it. Um, Again, this I want to share a interesting stat from this Forbes report. 69% of remote workers reported increased burnout from digital communication tools. So this is something that we would have to deliberately see how we can reduce the burnout for our remote learners. Because sometimes, although training sessions are not as long as they used to be in the past, sometimes the kind of content, the kind of requirement necessitates that we probably have a day long hybrid learning session. That's where we need to be very careful. And then, of course, there are tech issues, tech challenges. Murphy's Law, and if anything can go wrong, it will. And so we need to have a plan B, make IT department our best friend, and so on. So these are a couple of quick challenges. And as we go through the rest of the session, I'd like to share a couple of best practices based on our extensive experience in virtual instructor-led training, and then adapting that model to training a hybrid workforce.
Right. So one of the first things I think when it comes to VLTs is the materials. How do you really convert the ILT materials to VILT to make it meaningful and relevant and engaging for remote learners?
Right. That's really the starting point, Aleka. There are a couple of aspects, and I'd like to very quickly touch upon each of them. The first is,
Okay.
of course, the format and the technology. So, uh, although we have all arrived at our level of comfort in using technology, if you're using a new platform, for instance, then it would still be intimidating both for your learners and your facilitators. So, for those new to it, this is something we would need to keep in mind. And especially, if your organization has recently switched to another platform, then it requires us to get hands-on with it, getting familiar, and typically in virtual instructor-led trainings, we use many modalities. Uh, when it comes to an ILT, it's very straightforward. But in VILTs, because of the mix of modalities that we use, there is more upfront planning required so that our learners don't feel like they're being, dragged from one modality to another.
Right. So, actually, true. And given the nature of hybrid training, managing activities and facilitation for two sets of learners can get a bit tricky, right? Any suggestions on them?
Right. Actually, you've zeroed in on the crux of it because managing activities and the actual facilitation part of it is really smooth in a in-person classroom. Whether it's a group discussion, whether it's a whiteboard activity or a flip chart activity, it's very simple. People walk up, they put in their inputs, and then there's a discussion. But the same activity, when you're trying to convert to a VILT activity, can quickly become a logistical nightmare if we have not thought it through or if we have not handled it correctly. So, something as simple as a breakout room can go wrong if we have not planned it well. And another aspect of this conversion to ILT VLT to VLT is that sometimes we would need the support of a host or a producer to help us with the logistics of the activities, of implementing and executing these activities. Because ideally, the facilitator should be focused on the content and the audience and not have to worry about the technical aspects of the session. That said, I know a lot of us double up as hosts and producers and facilitators. So I think the responsibility on the facilitator has increased with remote learning. And with hybrid learners, it needs even more deliberate thought because you need to ensure both sets of learners have the same smooth experience.
Yeah, absolutely true. So, what about adding engagement and interactivity? This is easy when you have only in-person learners. How do you tackle this aspect when you have a combination of remote and in-person learners? Of course, it's a kind of, challenge we overhear from our customers as well.
Right, right. The first thing I can think of is, spontaneous activities, spontaneous engagements may not always work with a hybrid audience because in for an in-person classroom session, you can come up with activities on the fly. For those of us who are used to a very spontaneous way of training, now that obviously wouldn't work when you have a mixed group, when you have a mixed audience of in-person and remote people logging in. So we need to revisit our engagements and also factor for the fact that, for a lot of learners, they may seem a little forced initially because what we are trying to do is initially we're trying to overcome the learner isolation. And as a result, we may want to spend a little more time, even if it is not directly related to the content of the training session, we may want to spend a little more time in making sure that learners feel connected. So there would have to be a few more engagement activities right at the beginning than what we would need for an in-person session purely. So we would also need to tweak our existing engagements and for our hybrid learners Because the main thing here is to remember that, one set of learners is accessing everything using technology, and the other is not accessing it through technology. So this is where, the challenge is for us as facilitators, as learning solutions architects, to plan the hybrid training very deliberately.
Okay. So, what about the content part, Chalni? Is there anything to keep in mind when it comes to hybrid training?
Right. I think I did mention that, a lot of it would, while the core content, the essence, of what we are trying to impart remains the same, the other surrounding activities may have to be replaced, rewritten, or tweaked. So this is something we would need to do right at the beginning. Typically, VLT materials are developed by ILT trainers. So this is another area where if your facilitator is new to it, then there is every possibility of things slipping through the cracks. It really helps to have some kind of facilitated training as well for those who are new to handling hybrid training. Uh, One more thing I'd like to mention quickly, which I did touch upon, is that to overcome the limitations of the medium for remote learners, you may have to build in additional activities and engagements. And as I mentioned, these can occur in other channels apart from your main training room. Now, all these considerations matter because the instructions in our facilitator guides and participants guides depend on all the planning that happens upfront. So these are decisions on the format, the content, the technology. All of these are decisions that we would need to take right at the beginning. And we would probably want to consider a blended solution given what I mentioned about, digital communication fatigue and so on. This would involve saving valuable face-to-face time for activities which are really purely related to skill practice and keeping the self-study component in the form of learning, in the form of asynchronous learning, so that learners can come prepared. They can take the first component in their own time at their own convenience and then come prepared and be make a difference in the discussions and in the skill practice building sessions. Now, coming to, as I mentioned earlier, the technology is what makes all the difference in the experience for the remote learners vis-a-vis the experience for the in-person learners. So, of course, the technologies that we use differ from organization to organization. But a best practice is to integrate multiple mediums so that you can provide a seamless experience across channels, across platforms. So one best practice is have a generic channel for communication. This goes a long way in setting up your hybrid training for success because learners can interact with each other outside of the actual event and even before the actual event. The engagement, the reducing of learner isolation can start right there, so they are less likely to feel that they're being thrown in with a bunch of strangers when it comes to those group activities that I mentioned. And basically, as I mentioned earlier, to provide an inclusive, equal access to the same learning experience is very critical for the success of hybrid training. So this also includes things like setting up, making sure that we have the right technology and infrastructure in place. For instance, we need to consider that our remote learners would want to be able to see the facilitator, even if the facilitator is moving around the room, not necessarily seated at the laptop. So what do we use? Can we use some kind of motion sensor cameras which follow the facilitator? And also, how do they view the the in-person learners? Because that is something else which builds that connect, for all the learners to be able to see each other. And when it comes to technology, I think designating a point of contact for remote learners in case they face tech issues is also essential. So this could be either the host or a designated IT support person. And of course, one thing that really helps to make sure that it all comes together smoothly is to make sure that our learners are familiar with the features of whatever platform we are using, whether it's Teams or you know um, any other collaborative uh, training platform. Coming to the question of how do we maximize engagement, I think sharing the rules of engagement with learners is critical because it's important that our in person learners are sensitized to the fact that the remote learners may not feel that connected unless we are very deliberate and inclusive. It could be something as simple as, setting the rules of engagement. Setting the rules of engagement could be as something as simple as, letting people know in the session, in the in-person learners in the session know that uh, they need to minimize noise, the rustling of papers and the cross conversations that happen when people lean to their neighbor and start talking. All these, while they are not a big deal in a purely in-person training, they can become highly distracting for remote learners in a hybrid training session. And really, the challenge is for as a remote learner for me is to stay engaged without distractions. So this is something that we need to be mindful of. Another thing we can do to maximize engagement is to rotate participation opportunities between in-person and remote learners, because this again builds inclusivity. And as classroom facilitators, we tend to just read the room. We look at cues and we ask very informally for feedback. And sometimes there is a danger of forgetting the remote learners who, because they're probably more quiet than the in-person learners. No, we may forget to take periodic pulse checks from them as well. Now, another good practice is you pair remote learners with in-person learners. In case there is something that a remote learner needs to communicate or wants to be heard, and if there is too much of engagement happening and their voice is not heard, we can always just send a message and say, "Hey, I'd like to share something." So this is something a buddy kind of a system. And another thing I would like to mention is that we really need to establish the ground rules for small group activities and for making sure that we share out the learnings that happen in smaller groups with the larger team out there. And this also includes very clear instructions on what is expected of both sets of learners. And being remote does by no means imply that their contribution or participation is any less valued. Now, share something as simple as sharing materials and mechanisms for capturing inputs that can really build a lot of collaboration, and it eventually contributes to the success of hybrid learning. Now, when it comes to specific modalities that we use for engagement, if you don't have a huge group, you can always have the remote learners on video unmuting themselves and talking to the rest of the learners. Or if it's a big group, then maybe they can just use the raise hand feature in chat and so on. So, as I mentioned earlier, we need to be very clear about the group size and what works, because what may work for a small group can quickly get very disruptive if it is a larger group. Now, when it comes to modalities like features rather, or like breakout rooms, we need to really decide on the group size and composition. And again, this is where the challenge of a hybrid learner group comes in, because when it's just in-person learners, it's so easy to just divide them into groups and have them do their discussions and come back and share the findings. Now, how do we decide the composition? Do we make sure that one remote learner is included in every uh, breakout room, breakout discussion? If that is the case, then how do we, make sure that people can still discuss without disrupting um, the other groups in the room? So including a remote learner works if that group itself can go and sit in another isolated space where the audio interference doesn't disrupt the rest of the training. Now, not all of us have the luxury of having designated isolated spaces, which are also soundproof. So in which case, probably it would make more sense to just have the remote learners in one breakout room and the in-person learners into the various breakout rooms, uh, you know, in person, at across a table, for instance. And then how do we make sure that our for those remote learners joining in, how do we prepare these breakout rooms in advance? Um, can we set up some whiteboards with instructions or the activity that needs to be done? Because it's far easier for an in-person learner to quickly check with the facilitator on what exactly needs to be done than it is for a remote person. They may hesitate. B, it may always feel like, okay, this was already shared once, so I don't want to really ask again. So the whole idea is to make these sessions manageable, and in small group activities, while we are mindful of the limitations of time, it is also very important to focus on the social aspect of it. Now, we wouldn't want learners to jump into a group and just dive right into the topic, because in a lot of cases they're probably meeting each other for the first time. In such instances, again, we need to have a little bit of time set aside for just connections. So don't worry too much if you feel you're wasting the first 2 3 minutes. Those are really important to set the tone and the to make everybody feel welcome and included, which really is the starting point for them to start participating and engaging in the discussions. And when it comes to other activities like worksheet activities, when we look at our ILT materials, we can identify what will work, and we can decide on the modality, soft copies, hard copies to be shared. It's always a good practice to mail the workbooks beforehand to both sets of learners. And again, how do people share the what they've filled in? How do they take snapshots? We can have them, the remote learners, excuse me, take snapshots and post them in the channel that is being used for discussion. And again, these things have to be included in the instructions in the guides, respectively. Now, so all that was to do with the engagements, the interactivities, reducing learner isolation. How do we make people feel included? How do we enable peer-to-peer interaction? How do we ensure the facilitator focuses on both sets of learners equally, and so on? Now, I'd like to touch upon one best practice, which is nothing to do with the actual training content of the session, but it is to do with assessments. Now, how do we ensure equitable assessment mechanisms when it comes to hybrid training? So, this is one way in which we can really provide a very level learning field for both sets of learners. And one best practice that we found, which incidentally is also very useful in tracking, reporting, and getting data insights, is to offer online quizzes for both your remote learners and your in-person learners. Uh, this is because, offering online quizzes only for your remote learners and, giving hard copies to your in-person learners would be logistically not a smooth experience. And when it comes to data insights, again, you would be a little handicapped because you wouldn't have instant results visible for the in-person learners who are taking quizzes on hard copies, for instance. So it would be also very difficult to share the results, to see what are the patterns, and to discuss the areas where learners need additional help. Now this kind of data, this kind of scores is possible when we just make sure that everybody gets to answer online quizzes and take online exams. Now, of course, a related challenge is, how do we make sure that our in-person learners have access to these online quizzes? Now, many organizations allow mobile devices, and that makes it really straightforward for learners to respond to polls and take quizzes on their phones. However, if this policy doesn't exist, then we need to think of alternative methods such as providing laptops with uh, access to these online quizzes and also the polls. Uh, I'd like to just spend a minute on the polls because I believe that's another very quick win for us to engage our hybrid learners. Now, again, we need to make sure that our remote learners, while they have access to polls through the training platform itself, what about our in-person learners? So this is where they can just respond to the polls through their mobile devices, and that way the results come in, and the facilitator gets a real sense of what are the trends, what's happening out there, in terms of audience responses. Now, so these are some ways in which we can maximize engagement because it's not just when it comes to this last point that I touched upon. It's not just a matter of rolling out online quizzes, it's also a matter of using them as a starting point, using the results as a starting point for further discussions, especially around the incorrect responses and so on.
Uh, Thank you so much, Shani, for that detailed, explanation of adding engagement for both the learners. That's actually a very interesting angle of leveling the learners. Uh, Accordingly, are there any best practices you would like to conclude with?
Right. I think the biggest thing that, takeaway for us, especially in the post-pandemic era, when a lot of um, our customers were also figuring out how to make hybrid training work, is that
Right.
a hybrid work model really requires implementing a hybrid learning model. So, as I mentioned earlier, the blended learning approach, having flipped classrooms would really uh, would really be a powerful way to ensure that our learners come away with the most impactful solution, because you're not taxing people by calling them for face to face sessions, whether remote or in person, but you're giving them a chance to really develop their foundational concepts as self study at their own pace, at their own convenience, and then come totally prepared to actively participate and contribute to the, the actual hybrid training session. So, flipped classrooms are increasingly popular. And yeah, coming to the other best practices, I'd like to just reiterate what I shared earlier about addressing learner isolation. The biggest challenge here is, in-person learners have so many opportunities to engage with each other, even on a short break, water cooler talk, just walking out for a coffee. Now, this is where our remote learners can feel left out. So we really need to create these opportunities and check in with them a little bit more, connect with them, encourage our in-person learners also to interact with our remote learners if there is time to spare, even in the breaks. And one thing is, we can create opportunities for our learners to meet in person once in a while. It could be a day in office, a coffee in office, for instance, provided you have the same set of learners going through the same series of training programs. So, in which case, you can set up cohorts, and these cohorts stay together for the entire duration of that training series. So that way, there is also reduced learner isolation because they're already communicating outside of the of the main training software channel. They're using other generic communication channels, and that's where a lot of best practices get shared. There's a lot of user generated content also, which really enhances the entire learning experience. So, as facilitators, we need to kind of replicate those informal learning moments within the hybrid learning model. And I, I think another thing is one of the biggest challenge most of us face is the technology and infrastructure. So this is where we need to really let our IT departments know well before the actual event what exactly we need from them, so that they can coordinate the logistics of it. And it's always a good idea to conduct dry runs and ensure adequate support during sessions. And for those of us who have never been remote learners, I think it would really be helpful if we can step into the shoes of remote learners. Maybe, sign up for some remote learning event and see how you feel uh, in a hybrid setup. All of us are, I think, by now accustomed to being purely remote learners where meet other remote learners. But this kind of a hybrid learning model where you're meeting not just your fellow remote learners, but also your in person counterparts, that would be an interesting experience because that way you'll really experience as a learner the areas where you feel, you wish there was more help, more support. So I believe that, sensitizing facilitators and providing training for facilitators on how to handle hybrid sessions effectively can truly enhance the learning experience for everyone. And I'd like to just say that, I think one one thing we can really do is leverage all those lessons that we learned during the pandemic to build a sense of community and help our employees connect with our company culture. Because, employees who don't feel connected to the company culture are going to find it more challenging to participate in a hybrid learning session than those who feel very connected. So I think there are certain other things which we can do, you know, uh, which may not necessarily be connected to the actual training content of the session, but we can think of ways in which we can engage employees outside of the training, not just when it comes to calling them in for a hybrid learning session. So, I'd like to just very quickly conclude by saying that maximizing engagement in hybrid learning involves addressing learner isolation, leveraging technology effectively, leveraging lessons learned during the pandemic, and creating equitable assessment methods. So, by implementing all these best practices and strategies, I truly believe that we as organizations can create a more inclusive and effective hybrid learning experience for all participants. And with that, I come to the end of this podcast, but I'd like to just mention a very exciting event that we have lined up for all our listeners. We have an upcoming event called LearnFlux, which is a community of practice. It's a virtual learning event for L&D professionals. And this is a great chance for us to learn about industry insights, for us to network and collaborate, and also build our brand. So this our 10th gala edition is coming up in October. So we really encourage you to follow our social media uh, posts and sign up for this event. So with that, thank you. Thank you so much for listening in, and we hope that you'll continue to stay tuned in for our upcoming podcasts. Thanks, Alika.
Thank you so much, Shalini. It was great podcast. I hope our learners will also, like about because as this topic itself is a challenging topic. And thank you, all the participants over there. Thank you for tuning in to our e-learning champion pod.